Mound County Public Safety. How may I help you?
Yes, a person just woke me up and swears that she found her severed head of her son in the basement.
Can I talk to her?
Hello?
Can you tell me what's going on?
Pretty positive my son's head is in a bucket in my basement.
What is your son's name?
Sad Therian.
When's the last time you saw your son?
He was here a couple hours, then he left with Taylor.
Who's that?
Girl, Taylor.
Where's it at?
Go right there. Look right, there's a bucket with a towel on it.
Dude, it is. Hold on, just. That's real, right?
That's real, dog.
We're gonna need more units here.
When you see butchery like this in murder cases, it does suggest that the individual who perpetrated this violence had some sadistic tendencies or sadistic fantasies that they were able to carry out. This is not a typical murder.
Hi, Taylor. How's it going?
Contact.
Taylor, you have a warrant for your arrest. Put your hands behind your back. You got blood on your hands. You have blood on. No, on your hands.
She's kind of nonchalant.
Boyfriend. Well, they found a kind of disturbing stuff at the house there.
Oh, really?
Yeah, a lot of blood. Basically Shad's head.
If you're speaking with a police officer and he says, hey, this person you know, they found some disturbing things, and the first thing he says is a lot of blood, I mean, the natural reaction for any person is gonna be, oh my gosh, is he okay? Or something along those lines. So even though the pause before he gets to the even more shocking phrase of severed head, you can see, again, no reaction.
So what we do know about Taylor Shabusiness is that in the past, she has exhibited a number of behaviors and had a number of experiences. First, she has exhibited assaultive behavior towards other students in high school. We know that she's done drugs. We know that she is not free of a behavioral history of being able to be aggressive and hostile and violent. So all those things would be on a differential to try and sort out about what's going on with her and what happened with Shad.
Well, they found part of Shad at his house, his mom's house. Found his head. Where's the rest of his body?
It's there. It's at his house.
Can you tell me what happened?
It's a good question, because I blacked out during that time.
What do you think time would be?
I was right there by the bed.
It's by the bed, you think?
Yeah, I was cuddling by the bed. I was cuddling it by the bed.
Okay. You start to remember now what happened with Shad? What do you remember so far?
Well, there's this chain thing, right? And then, yeah, like I was playing around with it. And he put it around his neck while we were like playing around and then, I don't know, I was tugging on it and then,
You have any mental health issues we should be aware of?
I don't know yet.
It's curious that when they ask her about her mental health history, she states that she doesn't know yet. Makes me wonder if she's trying to set the stage to be able to avoid or mitigate her responsibility in this crime.
That's very typical of individuals with psychopathy in that they don't want to give too many details early on because they're still trying to figure out how they're going to spin the story.
So there was a chain.
I think it's on a dresser. It's just weird. I got like a weird flashback.
What did you see?
It was weird. I was riding him like a donkey.
So would this be considered foreplay?
Yeah, it was. And then I just didn't stop. I don't know why. I didn't stop.
Do you use manual strangulation during sex at all? Is Shad like that?
A manual strangulation? Yes.
But does anybody like strangle the other person?
Mainly me. I like doing it a lot. I like doing it to somebody else.
She's framing it right now as we were both into this thing, the strangulation. But as the story goes on, it becomes much more clear that this was an interest that she had prior to that evening. It's something that she's enjoyed before, and it's something she planned on doing. And it's not something particularly that maybe Shad was into. Shad suffered from depression. It might make him more vulnerable to believing that she cared about him, and then he would become more easily manipulated so that she could use him for whatever reason she needed.
Research has shown some correlation between psychopathy and sadistic behavior. She's describing it as if it was a consensual activity. But we know that ultimately she not only murdered him, but then dismembered him in a very vile way. So there's certainly some sadistic behavior that took place at her hands.
Was anybody home? Did you encounter anybody? I understand his mom lives here.
Carol?
Carol?
Is that the mom's name?
Yes.
Damn, hell. Yeah, I can't believe that.
Where'd you do with the body?
The body's there.
So we're gonna take the head somewhere?
I like that. I wanted the head.
So you dismembered the body too?
Yeah. They're gonna have fun trying to look for all the organs. But yeah, they're all dismembered.
And what did you do with the body?
Absolutely in the basement. And then I know I forgot the head. I wanted the head.
Did you bring anything with you?
Yeah, it's in the van. I think it's a foot.
She's almost completely detached from humanity as she's describing it. Even the fact that his mother found his head, the fact that this was someone she had a relationship with, it's her ex-boyfriend. And she's describing his dismembered body parts, again, almost with pride. And I think that the way that she states that is rather chilling and shows that there is truly no remorse and association with his human life.
How did you dismember his body?
Knives.
Where'd you get those from?
Kitchen. By mine, I wasn't sharp enough.
They weren't sharp?
No. It was alright. Redneck was good.
Bread knife?
I was getting pissed off at the dismemberment of plastic, actually. So I didn't even have to. I had fun with him for that 2 hours and then boom.
Where would these knives be now?
They're in with all the organs and all the body parts. I took it in next to a pink and black backpack that Shaq gave me. So I left it there.
Her descriptions are really clear. She's identifying items, color, where they are, what kind of knives. So she's now getting very specific, and also making some of the comments, they almost sound like dark humor. She's already throwing in little allusions to what's to come for the police officer.
Before the chain went around his neck, were you and Chad like kissing or any foreplay?
No, we were chilling at home. I was gonna walk him like a dog.
And he wanted that?
I have no idea. What am I gonna do it anyway? I was strangling. I was having fun with that. Well, I still felt his heartbeat, right?
You did?
I did. So I kept on pulling more and more and more, and I went back in. It's almost like he wouldn't die. I was like, dang.
So when did you realize that Chad was not alive anymore?
You know, his face turned purple. He was coughing up bloody. I still didn't stop. I don't know what's going on. And I'm like,
So you wanted him to die?
I didn't want him to die, actually. He's my buddy, but like it happened to him.
Oh, blood's going out of his mouth. What'd you do?
Clean him up a little bit. And then, I just played with him. And I just cuddled him and hugged him.
Shabusiness seems quite interested in control and domination. That's clear from when she even talks about walking him like a dog or riding him like a donkey. By ultimately strangling him until he died, she created a play object for her. We know from the records that she actually engaged in necrophilic acts with his body. She was again in complete control now that she had killed him.
So you realize that by continuing that you may actually kill him.
He was, I swear to God, he was telling me, he's just like, so I'm like, and I did it.
You know, did it make you happy? It was just kind of exciting.
Like, this is the thing that I have, like, I've always had, you know, like, you ever love something so much that you kill it?
Okay.
Like, it happens to me. That's the feeling that I have. I love something so much that I kill it.
Was it sexually exciting to you when you were choking Chad?
Yeah. Very. Boom.
People often wonder, what's the association between sexual arousal, violence? And she words it, you love something so much, you want to kill it. What we do know from a neurophysiologic standpoint, that extreme states of arousal, extreme states of rage have a similar neurochemistry. And so we think that in some people, that's why the two can get paired. Some people can find it emotionally a turn on when there's violence, and when there's violence occurring, it's arousing to them.
Why you knew that you didn't want to call the police or an ambulance?
Actually, I thought about it. And then I was getting angry at myself. Very angry at myself. have the proper tools. Sucks not having it.
And what do you think should happen if someone does something like this to somebody else?
I don't know. They obviously get prison time.
A 24-year-old woman charged in one of Brown County's most gruesome homicides is found competent to stand trial by a doctor. But the case against Taylor Shabusiness is not moving forward just yet.
Instead, another psychiatric evaluation is being allowed before a judge decides what to do next.
You went off on your attorney, Taylor. You went crazy on your attorney.
You can't do that here.
When she's in the courtroom, she notices cameras. She can play to the camera. She can smirk. She can interact. And so it's almost as if I can't put my expert on, I'll go ahead and attack my attorney and show people I'm crazy. I think it's deliberate because she's feigning the confusion like that's not how the psychiatric illness would manifest itself.
When you were reviewing the phone itself, the extraction of the phone itself on March 2nd of 2022, did you note any searches related to Jeffrey Dahmer?
24 total searches, such things like Jeffrey Dahmer walking into court all sexy.
And did you likewise see any photographs of Jeffrey Dahmer?
Yes, there's a picture of Jeffrey Dahmer on the screen of the cell phone, and she's smiling like they're taking a selfie together.
When we look at her fascination, her obsession with Jeffrey Dahmer, it's almost like a role model for her. Like it's someone she wants to be like or emulate. Jeffrey Dahmer, when he killed people, he liked to dismember them, keep the body parts. He liked to save the heads. And she's emulating that ideal.
You meet a person in school, you say he's your friend, you become friends, you become girlfriend, boyfriend, lovers, gain his trust, an innocent person.
I think he is. Somebody heard him, I'll find him who did it. So, if you know somebody that got pissed off at him or something. That's the thing, we're new up here. We honestly haven't met anybody besides my family.
I found a pair of pants. I found like a jacket, a coat, shoes. It stunk really bad. And I swore I seen a bone in there.
Authorities say residents at this duplex on North 22nd Street contacted police after finding burnt clothing, sneakers, and human remains inside a garbage can. The burnt material matches what John Swain had been wearing when he was last seen. Another resident returned home from vacation to find bloodstains on her rug.
What do you know about Theo?
I mean, I've known about him, but I don't know him.
Oh.
Left him up here, she left him. Go home.
Okay. Why'd she leave him?
And when she told me, she said that he was gonna kill her brother, and she left.
We have a missing person from Bismarck, okay? We have some items that were at the apartment that you were staying at. Identified those items as being worn by that missing person.
Okay, so am I being charged with anything, or?
Right now, no.
I mean, I wouldn't be too comfortable talking about this without a lawyer, present.
Here's the deal, Theo. I want you to think about this, okay? This kid has family that is desperately looking for him, that are concerned for him.
Crow communicates a great deal by his body language. We have an individual being interrogated by two detectives who's cool as a cucumber. So that gives us a good window in terms of just how devoid of emotion he is and how unworried he is.
Theo, he got kicked out of my mom's house after living in here.
Okay. Why did you get kicked out of your mom's house?
He hits my sister.
Okay. So you would have started staying at Megan. How was that for you guys?
Bad.
Bad. How was that bad?
Well, I didn't work because I felt like I couldn't trust him with my daughter because he was drinking heavily and he got into drugs. And he gets mad really easily.
It seems clear that Donnie is not only afraid of him, but she doesn't trust him with his daughter, and he's hit her sister. This is a very aggressive, violent, versatile criminal who's just doesn't obey the law and doesn't think the rules apply to him.
I'm freaking out, bro.
Why are you freaking out?
Because he killed somebody. He said I'd be pull a knife on him. And him and his friend.
I mean, you said you had a buddy there.
They said they did together.
Did you say which friend?
He did tell me his name, but I just don't remember. I think it's like a comment, like a Josh or something like that.
Yeah. I just want to let you guys know I'm going to cooperate fully. I was held at gunpoint. He stayed the night at our apartment. Not really sure why. And then he started getting on everybody's nerves. He was being cool with me, but he was starting with my cousin. So we decided, let's walk to the store and get some beers. He said, I'm gonna go see if we can score some weed. So we walked up to this park. He saw this little Asian kid there. Walked up to him, just started with him, yeah, you wanna grab some beers, come down to my house and hang out. Kid walked down the street, came into the place, we're just chatting with him. And out of nowhere, the guy that I used to work with just came out and hit the kid in the head with a hammer. He says, hey, check this out. Comes around the corner and just...
So, how many times did he hit him?
I'd say at least 4.
Oh, okay.
I mean, I remember one of them, he put the hammer around and the claw and stuck in his head.
They seemingly go out and meet this young boy, 18-year-old John Swain. They lure him back to their house, bashing his head in, and Clark doesn't sound scared or upset. He tells it like he's explaining how he went to the grocery store, which is not what a normal person would do.
On paper, Clark looks a lot cleaner, right? Is very careful in presenting himself as the unwitting witness to Crow's demonic plan. Maybe Clark is just a little bit better at hiding and dissimulating his real intentions and his real acts than Crow is.
I'm like, dude, this is up, man. He pulls out a 10 gauge, or 12, I don't know. Whatever it was, a gun, shotgun, cocked it, put it to my head and said, you can't tell anybody about this. You're gonna help me get rid of this.
What happened to the body, the kid?
He had it in the bathtub. He took a knife and cut him off at the knee joints. He made me help him wrap it up in a blanket and bring it out to his garage.
Where do you get the hammer from?
Somewhere by the door.
Did you have to help him cut him up?
No, I didn't. I don't think he made me cut him up. I mean, I don't know.
You might not remember what you had for breakfast, right? But you're gonna remember cutting up a body. And the fact that he refers to this human being recently deceased as it is further proof of the objectification of the victim. And that's very consistent with the way a psychopath thinks.
A new development in the case of 18-year-old John Swain. Bismarck police say they got a tip that Swain was buried in the backyard of this Montana home where Theo Crow lives with his mother.
All right. We have a search warrant right here for your DNA.
And speech and privilege for another person.
Hey, I guess I'm not sure what you want to talk to me about.
Confession. You know, sir, I've always been the type to, like, you know, take responsibility, you know, for what I've done.
So we spoke with I believe it was a Joshua Clark that said he was there.
Like I said, I don't know where to begin. I mean,
Clark tells us, I'm gonna fully cooperate. Crow says, I'm here to give a confession. Both are vying for control of the interaction with the detectives. They want to get ahead. They want to push their narrative so that they can control the outcome. And that's very psychopathic.
we're pretty drunk. Josh mentioned that he wanted to kill somebody. And I half believed him, half didn't.
Now, and you guys spoke before about it being a random person?
Yeah. We were just gonna walk to cover down somebody. He suggested a hammer. And so we had that with us.
Whose hammer was that?
It was Josh's. After we leave my place, we walked towards the school. There's a playground, a basketball court, and like a soccer field. Right across the way. And we ran into this guy.
What was that guy doing?
He was kicking a soccer ball.
I think that the way they went about selecting their victim is illustrative of some pretty significant psychopathic or antisocial tendencies. They identify a younger individual of smaller stature, purposefully choosing somebody who's isolated. It really feels like they view John as almost a pawn in a game that they're playing.
As we were sitting around listening, he was like, Josh, he told me, he said, you started off. Josh is talking to him. John's sitting on the sofa at the door.
So what happened then?
I'm standing there, and I have the hammer in my hand. But it's out of view from them. I turn around, and I hit him. Josh came over, and I either handed him or he took the hammer, and he started hitting him. I turned away. He hit him 5 to maybe 10 times. You know, just like 10 times, you know. I mean, like I knew he was dead. Josh goes in the bathroom to wash off the hammer. John was on the couch and there's blood everywhere.
There's not a whole lot of research about whether psychopaths essentially draw each other, but it makes sense. Imagine if you can find somebody who's like you, who wants to go and do these horrible things and doesn't really feel bad about it. If anything, egging each other on and showing each other this is totally okay to be this way.
He's face down. He's face down in the bathtub. Like Josh comes back and he had more than one, like two or three knives. He hands me one and I cut off his right leg at the knee. Josh cut off the left.
Was that difficult to cut him off?
Yeah, it was. I mean, not difficult as in physically, like, it was difficult emotionally, is what I'm trying to say.
He catches himself. In the end, again, he feels compelled to say that it was hard emotionally. I think he had to add that just because he heard himself speak, and it sounded horrible.
We wrapped him up. I said, we can put him in my garage. I knew I was gonna put the body in my mom's truck. I was gonna bury the body in my backyard.
Okay. What happened after that then?
We slept. I slept with a knife by the pillow. I remember I told Josh, I said, don't kill me, you know, while I'm sleeping. And he said, don't kill me.
At the end of the day, even when psychopaths may not know what they are, or they may not recognize it entirely in another person, they still know not to trust each other, because this guy will do the exact same thing to me that I'd be thinking about doing to him.
Now, Josh had said that he didn't do anything at the scene, and that it was all you. I'm not even going to want to do it. You know, I mean, he mentioned it, he brought it up. We used, you know, he provided the weapon, I mean, come on.
When people think of psychopaths, they think they have absolutely no emotion, and that's actually not true. Here we see Crow all of a sudden feeling upset because he feels very bad for himself, feels not at all bad for what they did to John Swain.
$15, $59 hours removing the tarp and bagging it up.
Like, I was at the wrong place at the wrong time.
I think both Crow and Clark had violent and homicidal fantasies that they brought out in each other, and that partnership allowed them to express desires that they had not had the outlet for in the past.
At this time, you are under arrest for participating in that murder.
Why exactly am I being charged, sir?
You took part in this, okay?
I didn't.
Okay, even by your own admission.
Found County Public Safety.
Pretty positive my son's head is in a bucket in my basement.
Hold on, just... That's real, right?
You ever love something so much that you can't?
white shoelace to wear on the bed rail, and I tied it around her throat.
Where do you leave your wife's mom? She was heavy. She's, pregnant.
Turns to me, holding the hammer out, and says, "You gonna bitch out?" I just took it from him, and I just with the hammer.
Did you ever tell him, "I want you to hurt or kill your family"?
I did encourage it, yes, I did.
I don't think he made me cut him up. I don't know.
The situation just looks like I'm a psycho.
The first thing they noticed was the silence, a thick unnatural quiet clinging to the stairwell of a narrow apartment block in Setagaya. The kind of silence that presses against the ears and tells you something has already gone wrong, long before a door is opened, long before a body is found, long before a case becomes a headline that refuses to die. It was December 30th, 1999, the city holding its breath for the turn of the millennium, neon signs counting down to a future that promised progress and order, while inside a modest second-floor unit time had stopped completely, frozen in a way that would haunt Tokyo for decades. The door wasn't locked. That detail would come back again and again. Inside, lights were still on. A half-eaten meal sat cooling on the table, rice hardening at the edges, chopsticks laid down as if someone had been interrupted mid-conversation. There were no signs of forced entry. No overturned furniture. No shattered glass. Just the creeping sense that violence had arrived quietly, confidently, and without warning. For members of the Miyazawa family lay dead. Parents. Children. A home turned into a crime scene that refused to make sense. Police flooded the apartment within hours, uniforms crowding the narrow rooms, cameras flashing, radios crackling with clipped voices. This wasn't supposed to happen here. This wasn't an alleyway crime, not a deal gone wrong, not a random street attack. This was a family home in a quiet neighborhood, the kind of place where neighbors recognized footsteps on the stairs and borrowed sugar from each other. The shock rippled outward apartment by apartment, street by street, until the entire city seemed to pause and ask the same question. How does something like this happen without anyone seeing, hearing, stopping it? The details, once released, only deepened the unease. The killer had stayed. Hours, possibly longer. He used items from inside the home. He ate food from the refrigerator. He used the bathroom. He left behind trash, fingerprints, DNA. This wasn't a hit and run. This wasn't panic. This was a presence, deliberate and disturbingly calm, as if the apartment had become a temporary shelter rather than a crime scene. Investigators would later say it felt less like a murder and more like an occupation. Tokyo's media moved fast. Headlines screamed massacre, cold-blooded, unimaginable. Talk shows speculated late into the night. Experts debated motives, profiles, theories. Was it personal? A grudge? A burglary gone wrong? Or something darker, something harder to name? The public wanted answers immediately, and for a brief moment it seemed like they might get them. The evidence list was unusually long. The killer had left behind a knife, clothing fibers, shoe prints, even a mix of foreign and domestic DNA that suggested travel, movement, a trail that could be followed. But days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and the answers never came. Detectives retraced the final hours again and again, walking through the apartment in their minds, measuring distances, reconstructing movements. The Miyazawas had been alive late into the evening. Neighbors reported nothing unusual. No screams, no loud arguments, no alarms. Just the normal hum of a city winding down for the night. Somewhere between routine and rest, an intruder entered and erased an entire family, leaving behind a puzzle with too many pieces and no clear picture. Leads poured in, thousands of tips, sightings that went nowhere, names that didn't match, faces that blurred together under the weight of expectation. The killer's DNA didn't match any database. The shoe prints suggested a brand not widely sold in Japan. The sand found in the apartment hinted at a beach far from Tokyo. Every clue seemed to point outward, away from the city, away from anything familiar, as if the crime itself had been imported, dropped into the heart of Tokyo like a foreign object the system couldn't digest. As the year 2000 dawned, fireworks lit the skyline, crowds cheered, clocks reset, and somewhere beneath the celebration, the case quietly began to cool. Investigators worked tirelessly, but the pressure was relentless. This wasn't just a murder investigation anymore. It was a test of competence, of trust, of the belief that order could be restored through diligence and logic. Each passing month without an arrest chipped away at that belief. The family's relatives waited. They held memorials. They spoke softly to cameras, voices tight with restraint, asking for justice without anger, without accusation. Their grief was private, but the case was public, dissected daily by strangers who would never know the sound of that apartment before it became infamous. The community installed lights, cameras, patrols. Parents walked children to school. Doors were double-checked. Tokyo, a city known for safety and predictability, learned a new word: vulnerability. Years passed. The investigation grew thick with paperwork, boxes of evidence stacked in storage rooms, detectives rotating in and out, each inheriting the same unanswered questions. Some believed the killer had left the country. Others believed he was still there, riding trains, blending into crowds, invisible by design. Occasionally, a headline would resurface. New DNA analysis. Cold case task force expanded. Breakthrough possible. Each time, hope flared briefly before settling back into disappointment. The phrase Tokyo 1999 cold case became shorthand for failure, for a mystery too large, too strange, too embarrassing to solve. Students studied it in criminology classes. Armchair detectives built theories online. Documentaries replayed the same images. The apartment exterior, the blurred family photos, the evidence bags held up like talismans that promised truth but delivered none. And then, decades later, everything changed. A press conference was announced with little warning. No leaks. No build-up. Just a brief notice that authorities had an update on the Miyazawa case. Reporters packed the room, skepticism thick in the air. They had heard this before. Another reanalysis. Another dead end dressed up as progress. Cameras rolled anyway. They always did. When the official stepped to the podium, the words landed like a controlled explosion. An arrest had been made. The cold case was officially closed. Gasps rippled through the room. Pens froze mid-scribble. Phones lit up across the city. The suspect, authorities said, had been living under a different name. The evidence, they claimed, was conclusive. DNA. Confession. A trail that finally led somewhere solid. After all these years, justice had arrived. But even as the announcement echoed through Tokyo, cracks began to show. Details were thin. Questions were deflected. Timelines didn't quite align. Journalists noticed what wasn't being said as much as what was. The suspect's background was vague. The confession, reportedly obtained after long interrogation, hadn't been recorded in full. Certain pieces of evidence that had once been highlighted were now conspicuously absent from the narrative. And then there was the matter of the cover-up. Whispers started almost immediately. Retired detectives speaking off the record. Former officials suddenly unavailable for comment. Documents sealed. Files reclassified. The story being presented was clean, efficient, satisfying in all the ways cold cases are expected to be when they're finally wrapped up with a bow. Too satisfying, some would say. The public reaction split down the middle. Relief on one side, suspicion on the other. For families who had waited years for closure, the announcement felt like a weight lifting. For others, especially those who had followed every twist and contradiction, the arrest felt less like an ending and more like a final attempt to silence a question that refused to go away. Online forum Reunited. Old theories resurfaced with new urgency. People compared past statements with current claims, highlighting inconsistencies, contradictions, moments where the official story bent just slightly out of shape. Why now? Why this suspect? Why were certain foreign DNA markers suddenly deemed irrelevant? Why had some early leads been abandoned so quickly, only to resurface decades later in altered form? The word cover-up began to circulate, cautiously at first, then louder. Not as an accusation but as a possibility, a suggestion that the truth might be more complicated, more uncomfortable than the version being offered. That perhaps the pressure to close the case, to restore faith, to finally erase the stain of an unsolved massacre, had outweighed the obligation to confront every unanswered question. Tokyo moved on as cities do. Trains ran on time. Lights flickered on at dusk. New families moved into new apartments. But the Setagaya home remained a landmark of sorts, a quiet reminder of a night when order collapsed and never fully returned. The case was closed on paper, sealed in archives, summarized in official statements. Yet the feeling lingered that something essential had been left unresolved. Because cold cases don't always end when an arrest is made. Sometimes they end when the right story is told. And sometimes the most disturbing possibility isn't that a killer escaped justice, but that the truth itself was quietly buried, layer by layer, until all that remained was a conclusion everyone was asked to accept, and no one was allowed to question. And in the shadow of that acceptance, the silence returned. The silence didn't end with the press conference, it deepened, thickened, spreading through the cracks of the official narrative like smoke that refuses to dissipate. Because once the initial shock faded, once the headlines moved from arrest made to case closed, people began to notice how carefully controlled the information had become, how every statement felt rehearsed, polished, designed to seal something shut rather than open it up. The suspect's name was released late, almost as an afterthought, attached to a grainy photo that showed a man whose face revealed nothing, a face that could belong to anyone on a crowded Tokyo platform at rush hour, forgettable by design, and authorities insisted this anonymity was necessary. Procedural routine, yet nothing about this case had ever been routine. They said he had lived quietly for years, drifting between jobs, addresses, identities, leaving no obvious trace that linked him back to the night of December 30th, 1999, except now, suddenly, everything linked back to him. DNA that had sat unmatched for decades was declared a perfect fit. Fibers once labeled inconclusive were now described as definitive. The foreign markers that had fueled speculation about an outsider were reframed as irrelevant anomalies, contamination, statistical noise. The story narrowed, sharpened, simplified, until the chaos of the original crime was reduced to a single, convenient explanation. But cold cases don't usually end this neatly. They fray. They resist closure. And this one had too many loose ends for anyone who remembered the early days, when investigators themselves admitted they were dealing with something unprecedented. Back then they had spoken openly about multiple possibilities, about uncertainty, about the likelihood that key pieces of the puzzle were still missing. Now, uncertainty had vanished from the vocabulary entirely. The language shifted from investigation to resolution, from questions to conclusions. Behind the scenes, the machinery of the justice system moved fast. The suspect was transferred, processed, charged. Court dates were set with unusual speed. Requests for access to original evidence were denied. Independent forensic review was deemed unnecessary. Officials cited the age of the case, the sensitivity of the materials, the need to protect the integrity of the prosecution. Integrity became the shield, wielded to deflect curiosity rather than satisfy it. Journalists who had covered the case since the beginning felt it immediately, that subtle but unmistakable pushback. Calls went unanswered. Sources went silent. Former investigators who had once spoken freely now declined interviews or offered only vague, careful remarks that said everything by saying nothing. One retired detective, his voice barely above a whisper, would later say off the record that the arrest felt decided long before the evidence caught up, that the conclusion had been selected first, and the path toward it constructed afterward. The public didn't hear that part, not officially. What they heard was reassurance. Statements about closure, about justice delayed but not denied, about the strength of perseverance. The Miyazawa family's relatives were shown accepting the news with solemn nods, their faces unreadable, their grief too deep to be neatly framed by a camera lens. No one asked them whether they believed this was the truth. No one asked whether closure was something that could be handed to them by a system that had failed for so long. Online, the reaction was raw. Old forums sprang back to life, usernames reappearing after years of inactivity. People pulled archived articles, screenshots, forgotten press releases, lining them up side by side with the new statements. They noticed how timelines had shifted, how times once described as estimates were now presented as facts, how certain investigative dead ends were quietly erased from the record. The sand sample, once traced to a specific coastal region, was now vaguely described as inconclusive. The shoe brand, once rare, was suddenly common. The killer's behavior, once considered highly unusual, was reframed as impulsive, disorganized, easier to explain, easier to dismiss. But the apartment itself told a different story, one that had never quite fit the official explanations. The killer had moved through the space with confidence, navigating rooms in the dark, accessing storage areas, finding items without hesitation. He had lingered unafraid of discovery, unhurried by the risk of capture. That kind of behavior suggested familiarity, planning, or at the very least a sense of protection, a belief that he would not be interrupted. The new suspect's background as presented offered none of that. No known connection to the family, no prior visits, no reason to feel safe in that space for hours after committing an unspeakable act. Then there was the timeline of the arrest itself. It didn't emerge from a sudden tip or a breakthrough piece of evidence. It followed a restructuring of the cold case unit, a change in leadership, a renewed emphasis on clearing unsolved cases ahead of a major anniversary that threatened to reopen old wounds. Pressure, both internal and public, had been mounting. The Tokyo 1999 cold case had become a symbol, an uncomfortable reminder of a failure that couldn't be spun or forgotten. Closing it wasn't just about justice. It was about image. That context mattered, but it was never mentioned in official briefings. Instead, the narrative focused on perseverance, on the idea that time, technology, and dedication had finally converged. And for some, that was enough. They wanted to believe that the system worked, that patience was rewarded, that even the darkest mysteries eventually yield to order. Doubt, after all, is exhausting. Suspicion corrodes. Acceptance is easier. Yet doubt persisted, fueled by the smallest details. The confession, reportedly the linchpin of the case, was summarized but never released in full. It aligned perfectly with the prosecution's version of events, hitting every necessary point without deviation, without confusion, without the messiness that often characterizes genuine admissions of guilt after decades of silence. Skeptics called it scripted. Supporters called it thorough. The truth remained locked behind closed doors. As the trial approached, security tightened. Media access was limited. The courtroom became another controlled environment, where the narrative could be maintained without interference. Experts who questioned the handling of evidence were dismissed as fringe voices. Calls for transparency were reframed as disrespectful to the victims. The moral high ground was claimed decisively, leaving little room for nuance or dissent. Outside, life continued, but the case cast a long shadow. Younger generations who had only known the story as a cautionary tale now saw it transformed into a lesson about patience and trust. Older residents remembered the fear, the unease, the way the crime had cracked something open in the collective psyche. They remembered the promises made back then, promises about accountability, about truth, about learning from failure. Watching the case close so abruptly felt less like fulfillment and more like erasure. The word cold case lost its meaning in the official lexicon, replaced by resolved, concluded, closed. But in the minds of many, the case remained exactly what it had always been. A question mark etched into the city's history, a reminder that some answers come too cleanly to be true. And as the legal process marched forward, as verdicts loomed and statements were prepared, an unsettling thought began to take hold, one that refused to be silenced by press releases or courtroom formalities. What if the arrest wasn't the end of the story, but the final act of a much longer one? What if the real mystery wasn't who committed the crime, but how the truth had been managed, reshaped, contained? What if the decades-long cover-up wasn't about hiding a killer, but about protecting something far more fragile, the illusion that everything eventually can be explained? The city didn't ask these questions out loud, not officially, but they lingered in the gaps between statements, in the pauses during interviews, in the uneasy feeling that settled whenever someone said the case was finally over. Because for a cold case like this, closure wasn't a door being closed. It was a lock being turned quietly, firmly, with the key disappearing into a place no one was meant to look. What few people realized at the time was that the arrest didn't just close a case, it reopened old wounds inside the system itself, fractures that had been sealed over with procedure and politeness, fractures that now began to whisper. Inside police headquarters, away from cameras and carefully worded statements, there were officers who stared at the case file with a feeling they hadn't allowed themselves to acknowledge in years, A feeling that something fundamental had been skipped, rushed past, smoothed over for the sake of an ending everyone desperately wanted. The Miyazawa file was thick, heavy with decades of notes, revisions, crossed-out theories, and in its early pages the tone was different, raw, uncertain, honest in a way the final reports no longer were. Back in 2000, investigators had documented confusion openly. They had written about contradictions they couldn't reconcile, about evidence that pointed in opposing directions at the same time. One memo described the killer's movements as methodical and familiar. Another called them erratic but confident, language that hinted at a profile too complex to fit into a single explanation. Those descriptions never made it into the modern summary of the case. They were buried beneath layers of reinterpretation, translated into something simpler, something easier to present to a public hungry for resolution. The foreign DNA had been one of the most troubling elements from the beginning. It didn't just suggest an outsider. It suggested a history, a trail that extended beyond Japan's borders, beyond the jurisdiction and comfort zone of local investigators. Early collaboration with international agencies had produced nothing conclusive, but it had raised uncomfortable questions about how much could realistically be pursued, how far resources could stretch, how much uncertainty an institution could tolerate before it began to pull back. Over time, those questions were quietly sidelined. The DNA didn't disappear, but its significance diminished, reframed as background noise rather than a central thread. Years later, when the suspect was identified, the explanation was clean. The foreign markers came from distant ancestry, irrelevant to the crime itself. It was a plausible answer, technically sound, scientifically defensible. But it wasn't the answer investigators had been leaning toward in the early days, and that shift mattered. It suggested not a discovery, but a decision. The same pattern appeared in witness statements. Neighbors who had reported unfamiliar sounds, footsteps, doors opening and closing at odd hours, were initially taken seriously. Their accounts were logged, analyzed, compared. As time passed and no suspect emerged, those statements were downgraded, labeled unreliable, distorted by memory, contaminated by media exposure. When the case was reopened years later, only a fraction of those accounts were referenced, selected to align neatly with the revised timeline. The rest were left to gather dust, inconvenient remnants of a Messier truth. The suspect's confession, when examined closely, raised its own questions. It contained details that had been public knowledge for years, details anyone deeply familiar with the case could recite. The truly obscure elements, the ones only the killer would know, were summarized but not disclosed. Prosecutors said releasing them could jeopardize the integrity of the case. Critics argued the opposite, that transparency was the only way to test the confession's authenticity. The debate never reached the courtroom. The decision had already been made. For the detectives who had worked the case in its infancy, watching from the sidelines now, the arrest was bittersweet at best. Some felt relief that the burden was finally lifted, that the case would no longer define their careers. Others felt something closer to loss, a sense that the story they had lived through was being rewritten without their consent. One former investigator, speaking anonymously years later, described it as watching someone else finish your sentence, but in a language you don't recognize. Outside the system, the community carried its own version of the truth. People remembered how the fear had settled into everyday life, how routines had changed, how trust had eroded. They remembered patrol cars idling longer on quiet streets, the way parents scanned faces more carefully, the way a single crime had punctured the assumption that safety was a given. For them, the arrest didn't erase those memories. It didn't retroactively restore what had been lost. If anything, it complicated it, replacing one uncertainty with another. The media, once relentless, now moved cautiously. Investigative pieces were softened, framed as reflections rather than challenges. Editors weighed the cost of pushing too hard against the potential backlash of undermining a narrative of justice finally served. Advertisers preferred closure to controversy. Viewers, exhausted by years of ambiguity, were ready to move on. The story slipped from the front pages, replaced by newer tragedies, fresher scandals. But cold cases have a way of lingering, even when officially buried. They live on in margins, in footnotes, in the quiet insistence of people who can't quite let go. Academics revisiting the case for research noticed discrepancies in the way evidence had been categorized over time. Dates changed. Labels shifted. What was once unknown became irrelevant. What was once possible became unlikely. Each change was minor on its own, defensible, almost invisible. Together, they formed a pattern that suggested drift rather than discovery. The apartment in Setagaya, long since vacated and repurposed, remained a focal point for that unease. Visitors described an odd heaviness, a sense that the space still held unanswered questions. It wasn't superstition. It was memory, embedded in walls that had witnessed something the official story could not fully account for. The killer's prolonged presence there, the casual consumption of food, the use of household items, all pointed to a psychology that didn't align neatly with the profile now being presented. As the trial progressed, the prosecution's narrative held firm. The defense was restrained, almost passive, focusing on procedural points rather than challenging the core story. Observers noted the lack of fireworks, the absence of dramatic confrontation. This wasn't a battle over truth. It was a procession toward a foregone conclusion. The verdict, when it came, felt less like a revelation and more like a confirmation of what had already been decided. Officially, justice had been done. Statements were issued. Condolences repeated. The case was marked as closed in databases and reports. The Tokyo 1999 cold case, once a symbol of uncertainty, was now a success story, cited as proof that perseverance pays off. The system congratulated itself quietly, relieved to have finally put an end to a chapter that had lingered too long. And yet, beneath that relief, the questions persisted, sharper now because they had been denied a proper hearing. If this was the truth, why did it require so much silence to maintain? Why did it feel so fragile, so dependent on controlled narratives and sealed records? Why did so many who knew the case best seem reluctant to celebrate? In the end, the most unsettling aspect wasn't the possibility that the wrong person had been arrested. It was the realization that the process itself had become the story, that over the years the focus had shifted from understanding what happened in that apartment to managing how it would be remembered. The crime had frozen time in 1999. The investigation had stretched it thin across decades. And the resolution, rather than releasing the tension, had compressed it into something dense, opaque, and profoundly unsettling. Because when a cold case ends this way, with answers that silence rather than satisfy, it leaves behind a different kind of mystery, one that doesn't ask who committed the crime, but who decided the truth and at what cost. The cost became clearer as time passed, measured not in headlines but in absences, in conversations that stopped mid-sentence, in documents that could no longer be found. Requests for archival access were met with polite refusals, explanations wrapped in legal language about preservation and privacy, yet insiders knew that entire sections of the original file had been reclassified, their contents now accessible only to a shrinking circle of officials. What had once been an open, if frustrating investigation had transformed into a sealed artifact, protected less by certainty than by authority. In the early years, mistakes had been acknowledged openly. Leads were missed. Assumptions proved wrong. Resources were misallocated. Those admissions had been painful but human. Signs of a system struggling honestly with something it did not yet understand. Decades later, those imperfections had been edited out of the story. The final narrative allowed no room for doubt, no space for human error. It presented an image of inevitability, as if the truth had always been there, waiting patiently to be uncovered, rather than shaped and reshaped by pressure, fear, and institutional pride. One former forensic analyst remembered a meeting from the mid-2000s, long before the arrest, when the case was already slipping into legend. She recalled senior officials discussing not just evidence, but optics, talking about how the case reflected on the department, on the city, on the country's reputation for order and safety. At the time, it sounded like long-term planning, like realism. In hindsight, it felt like the beginning of a shift from investigation to containment. That shift wasn't sudden. It happened gradually, almost imperceptibly, as priorities changed and personnel rotated. New detectives inherited the case without the emotional weight of the original shock. For them, the Miyazawa murders were a file, a challenge, a career-defining opportunity if solved, a liability if not. The longer it remained unsolved, the heavier it became, until the pressure to resolve it, by any means available, began to outweigh the desire to understand it completely. The suspect fit that need perfectly. He wasn't prominent. He wasn't powerful. He didn't come with allies or public sympathy. His life as presented was fragmented, marked by instability, making it easy to frame him as capable of something extreme. The narrative wrote itself. A drifter, an outsider, someone who slipped through cracks and emerged in the darkest possible way. It was a story the public recognized, one that required little explanation and invited little empathy. Yet those who dug deeper noticed inconsistencies that couldn't be ignored. The suspect's movements during the critical period were reconstructed with gaps filled by assumptions rather than evidence. Alibis were dismissed not because they were disproven but because they were inconvenient. Surveillance footage that might have clarified key moments was said to be unavailable, lost to time, overwritten, erased by routine processes no one could now verify. Each explanation made sense on its own. Together they formed a fog. The apartment's layout, meticulously documented in early reports, raised questions that were never fully addressed in court. The killer's path through the rooms suggested a familiarity that went beyond chance. Drawers were opened without hesitation. Items were located quickly. There was no sign of searching, no trial and error. Investigators once speculated that the killer might have observed the family beforehand, studied their routines, perhaps even been inside the apartment previously. That line of inquiry went nowhere officially. Unofficially, it was abandoned. Why it was abandoned became another unanswered question. Surveillance in the neighborhood had been limited at the time, but not non-existent. Records of who had access to the building, who might have known the family's schedule, who had reason to feel comfortable in that space were incomplete. Some of those records no longer existed. Others were deemed irrelevant under the new theory of the case. Familiarity was replaced by spontaneity, planning by impulse, confidence by chaos. The city accepted this reframing quietly. There were no protests, no mass outcry. Fatigue played its part. After decades of waiting, many people were simply ready to believe. Closure, even imperfect closure, offered relief. It allowed the story to end, to be filed away, to stop intruding into daily life. For younger generations, the case became history, something resolved before they were old enough to care. But for those who remembered the night itself, the fear and confusion, the sense that something fundamentally wrong had happened in a place that was supposed to be safe, the new explanation rang hollow. They remembered how the killer had lingered, how he had eaten, rested, existed in that space as if time had stopped for him alone. They remembered investigators admitting, openly, that this behavior defied easy categorization. Watching it now reduced to a footnote felt like a betrayal of that honesty. Even within the courts, there were moments of unease. A judge reportedly questioned the limited disclosure of evidence, though the concern never made it into the official record. Procedural efficiency took precedence. The case had waited long enough, it was said. Dragging it out further would only reopen wounds. Justice required decisiveness. That logic prevailed. After the verdict, commemorations were held. Statements emphasized remembrance and resilience. The Miyazawa family's names were spoken with reverence, their lives summarized in a few careful sentences that struggled to capture their fullness. The suspect was sentenced, his future reduced to a number, a place, a permanent label. On paper, the balance was restored. And yet, in the margins, dissent lingered. Not loud, not organized, but persistent. Academics continued to cite the case as an example of how long-running investigations can drift under pressure. Journalists kept private files, notes they never published, questions they never stopped asking. Retired officers met quietly, sharing memories that no longer matched the official version, unsure whether they were protecting the truth by speaking or preserving it by staying silent. The phrase decades-long cover-up began appearing more frequently, not in mainstream headlines, but in discussions, essays, late-night conversations. It wasn't always framed as malicious. Sometimes it was described as institutional self-preservation, sometimes as fear, sometimes as the cumulative effect of small compromises made over many years. The idea that no single moment defined the cover-up, that it emerged gradually, almost unintentionally, made it harder to confront and easier to deny. As time moved on, the case settled into a strange limbo. Officially resolved, unofficially unsettled. The apartment, the evidence, the verdict all existed, fixed points in a narrative that claimed finality. But beneath that surface, the sense of something unresolved persisted. Like a low-frequency hum you only notice when everything else goes quiet. Because the truth, whatever it was, had become secondary to the need for an ending. And endings once declared are difficult to undo. The Tokyo 1999 cold case was closed, its files stamped and archived, its story simplified for public consumption. But the questions it raised about how justice is shaped, about who controls memory, about what happens when resolution becomes more important than understanding, remained stubbornly open. And in that space between what was said and what was never allowed to be asked, the case continued, not as an investigation, but as an echo, repeating itself in the minds of those who knew that some silences are louder than any confession. By the time the echoes settled, a new question began to surface, quieter than accusations, harder to dismiss than rumors. If the truth had been compressed, where had the excess gone? Truth, after all, doesn't simply vanish. It gets stored, displaced, redistributed into places people stop looking. In this case, it seeped into forgotten interviews, half-remembered conversations, marginal notes written by exhausted detectives at 3 a.m, notes that no longer fit the official chronology but refused to lose their meaning. One such note resurfaced years after the verdict, uncovered by a journalist combing through a private archive donated by a retired officer's family. It was brief, almost careless, yet it carried a weight the polished reports lacked. It described the killer's demeanor not as frantic or panicked, but as settled, a word chosen deliberately, underlined once, as if the writer wanted to remind himself that this detail mattered. Settled didn't align with the final profile. Settled suggested intention, comfort, an internal logic that hadn't been accounted for. That logic haunted the case in subtle ways. The killer's choice to remain in the apartment, to eat, to rest, to exist there after the murders, was framed officially as reckless behavior, a sign of disorganization. But seasoned investigators knew recklessness usually comes with urgency, with mistakes made in haste. This was different. The longer the killer stayed, the more it looked like a calculation rather than an impulse, a decision based on an assessment of risk that turned out, disturbingly, to be accurate. No one interrupted him. Non avernakt. No patrol passed close enough to raise suspicion. The night unfolded exactly as he seemed to expect it would. That expectation implied knowledge not just of the apartment, but of the rhythms of the building, the street, the neighborhood. It implied a familiarity that the final narrative struggled to explain away. In the years before the arrest, this line of thinking had been explored cautiously. Investigators had considered whether the killer might have had indirect access to the family, perhaps through work, school, or social connections that left little formal trace. They had looked at service workers, contractors, acquaintances who passed briefly through the family's life. None of those avenues produced a clear suspect, but they shaped the understanding of the crime, emphasizing proximity over randomness. That understanding disappeared almost entirely from the case's closing chapter. Instead, the final explanation leaned heavily on abstraction, psychological instability, opportunism, chance. These concepts were flexible enough to cover gaps, broad enough to absorb contradictions. They offered a way to move forward without revisiting uncomfortable questions about how someone could enter a family's home, stay for hours, and leave behind evidence without being detected, all while fitting so neatly into the environment that he might as well have belonged there. The suspect, when viewed through this lens, became less a person and more a placeholder, a vessel into which unresolved anxieties could be poured. His past was presented selectively, highlighting traits that supported the theory while minimizing those that complicated it. Contradictions in his history were smoothed over. Inconsistencies were attributed to faulty memory. Complexity was reduced to pathology. Those who attempted to challenge this portrayal found themselves speaking into a void. Their questions were not answered directly. They were reframed as distractions, as disrespect, as an inability to accept closure. The language of finality proved powerful. It shut down debate not by refuting it, but by declaring it unnecessary. And yet, the debate persisted in quieter forms. Academic papers explored the psychology of prolonged investigations, and the institutional pressures that shape their outcomes. They cited the Tokyo 1999 case without naming it outright, describing a hypothetical scenario that mirrored its trajectory too closely to be coincidence. The conclusions were careful, measured, but unmistakable. The longer a case remains unsolved, the greater the risk that resolution becomes a goal in itself, detached from the pursuit of truth. Former officers read these papers with mixed emotions. Some recognized their own experiences in the footnotes, the subtle descriptions of meetings where strategy blurred into storytelling. Others dismissed the critiques as hindsight bias, the luxury of analysis unburdened by real-world constraints. But even among the skeptics, there was an acknowledgement that something about this case had never settled properly, that the ground beneath the conclusion felt unstable. The Miyazawa family's home, though no longer the same in form or function, continued to anchor these doubts. People who lived nearby spoke of it with a kind of reverence, not fear but awareness. It wasn't the site of a ghost story. It was the site of an unanswered question. Children who grew up in the area learned about it not as a solved crime, but as a warning, a reminder that certainty can be constructed, even when understanding is incomplete. As anniversaries passed, official statements grew shorter, more generic. The case no longer required explanation. It had been categorized, archived, absorbed into statistics. But memory doesn't obey archives. It resists categorization. It clings to details that don't fit, to moments that feel unresolved. And in this case, memory kept circling back to the same image. A stranger sitting at a family's table, eating their food, unafraid of discovery, as if the world outside that apartment had momentarily ceased to exist. That image refused to reconcile with the idea of a crime solved by chance and persistence alone. It suggested something deeper, something structural, something that reached beyond a single individual. It suggested that the story told at the end was not the story that began that night, but a version shaped by years of pressure, compromise, and the human need for an ending. In quiet moments, even those who accepted the verdict found themselves unsettled by this disconnect. They couldn't articulate it fully, couldn't point to a single flaw that unraveled the whole, but they felt it nonetheless. A sense that the case had been closed like a book with pages still stuck together. The ending visible, the middle compressed, the beginning obscured. Cold cases, when resolved honestly, bring a different kind of silence, one that feels earned, heavy but peaceful. This silence was different. It was tense, brittle, the kind that follows an argument that never quite happened. It carried within it all the things that hadn't been said, all the questions that had been deemed too inconvenient, too destabilizing, too late. And so the Tokyo 1999 case lived on in that silence, officially concluded yet emotionally unresolved. A reminder that justice is not just about naming a culprit, but about confronting complexity without fear. The arrest had provided an answer. What it hadn't provided was relief. And in the absence of relief, the story continued, not forward but inward, folding back on itself, waiting for someone brave enough or desperate enough to pull it open again. The folding inward didn't happen all at once. It began with small disturbances, barely perceptible, like a pressure change before a storm. A retired clerk from the Metropolitan Police quietly mentioned, over drinks, that an evidence log from the early 2000s didn't match the version cited in the trial. A graduate student working on a thesis noticed that a key forensic reference in a government white paper had been quietly revised years after publication. None of it was explosive on its own. None of it made headlines. But together they suggested movement beneath the surface, a subtle rearranging of the past. What had changed most, people realized, wasn't the facts themselves, but the confidence with which they were presented. Early investigators had spoken in probabilities, in margins of error, in uncomfortable maybes. The final narrative spoke in absolutes. It had stripped away hesitation, replaced it with certainty so complete it felt almost aggressive. Doubt was no longer part of the conversation. Doubt was treated as a threat. Inside the system, this shift had consequences. Younger officers, trained after the case was officially closed, learned it as a solved crime, a benchmark of perseverance rather than a cautionary tale. They studied the final report, not the drafts that came before it. They memorized conclusions without inheriting the questions that had once shaped them. Institutional memory narrowed, not through malice but through efficiency. Only what was deemed relevant survived. But some memories resisted that pruning. An emergency responder who had entered the apartment that night remembered the smell first. Not blood, but food, warm and out of place, an everyday scent colliding with something catastrophic. He remembered thinking briefly, irrationally, that someone must still be alive because dinner had just been made. That detail never appeared in any report. It didn't fit anywhere. It lingered only in his mind, resurfacing whenever he heard the case described as chaotic or impulsive. Another responder remembered the trash. The way it was tied. The way it was placed. Not hurried, not sloppy. It was a mundane observation, one that sounded ridiculous when spoken aloud, so it was never emphasized. But it nagged at him. People in crisis don't take care with trash. People who expect time do. These fragments of memory circulated quietly, passed between people who no longer wore badges, people who had nothing to gain by reopening old wounds. They didn't form a new theory. They didn't point to a new suspect. They simply resisted erasure. They were reminders that the crime, as experienced in real time, had felt different from the story now being told about it. The suspect, meanwhile, faded into the background of his own case. After sentencing, his presence became abstract, reduced to legal filings and occasional appeals that went nowhere. Interviews were denied. Psychological evaluations were sealed. The person at the center of the resolution became inaccessible, almost irrelevant, a symbol rather than a subject. For some, this absence reinforced guilt. For others, it deepened unease. If this was the man who had ended the mystery, why did he feel so peripheral to it? In the years following the verdict, requests to revisit physical evidence increased, not dramatically, but steadily. Advances in forensic science promised new insights, greater precision. Each request was declined with the same explanation. The case was resolved, further testing unnecessary. The door wasn't just closed. It was reinforced. The message was clear. There would be no second look. This resistance created a paradox. The more firmly the conclusion was defended, the more fragile it appeared. Confidence that cannot tolerate scrutiny begins to look like fear. People noticed. They spoke about it cautiously, framing their concerns as philosophical rather than factual. What does justice require? What does closure mean? When does finality serve the public, and when does it serve the institution? These questions gained quiet traction, especially among those who had grown up with the case as background noise. A story always there, unresolved, shaping their understanding of safety and trust. For them, the sudden neatness of the ending felt alien, disconnected from the messy reality they had inherited. They weren't emotionally invested in a particular outcome. They were invested in coherence. And this story, as finalized, lacked it. The apartment remained the unspoken center of gravity. Even altered, even repurposed, it carried a residue of attention. People slowed as they passed. Not out of superstition but respect. Something important had happened there, something that transcended the official explanation. The space had been violated not just by violence, but by certainty imposed after the fact, certainty that smothered questions rather than answering them. At night, the neighborhood returned to its routines. Lights flicked on and off. Footsteps echoed in stairwells. Life asserted itself. But beneath that normalcy, the memory of that night lingered, not as fear but as awareness. The understanding that order is fragile, and that restoring it sometimes requires stories that are smoother than reality. In professional circles, the case became a reference point in discussions about institutional narrative control. Not publicly, not by name but through analogy. A long unsolved crime. A sudden arrest. A decisive conclusion. The pattern was familiar. The lesson was uncomfortable. Resolution once achieved tends to justify itself retroactively. Every step leading to it becomes by definition correct. Those who questioned this logic were careful. They didn't accuse. They analyzed. They spoke about incentives, about pressures, about the human desire to close loops. They pointed out that cover-ups are rarely orchestrated conspiracies. More often, they are accumulations of small decisions, each one reasonable in isolation, each one nudging the truth slightly out of alignment until it no longer matches reality. The Tokyo 1999 case fit this model too well to ignore. No single moment stood out as corrupt or malicious. There was no smoking gun, no dramatic revelation, Just a gradual narrowing of acceptable interpretations, a slow migration from exploration to enforcement of a chosen conclusion. By the time the arrest was made, the outcome felt less like a discovery and more like the fulfillment of an internal necessity. For the public, this nuance was largely invisible. Life moved on. New cases demanded attention. New fears replaced old ones. The cold case faded into the background, a resolved story filed under history. But for those who had lived with it, studied it, carried it, the ending never quite landed. They understood, perhaps more clearly than ever, that some stories don't end when they're told. They end when they're understood. And understanding requires openness, patience, and the willingness to sit with uncertainty longer than is comfortable. That willingness had been exhausted long before the arrest. So the case remained suspended between resolution and doubt, a closed file with an open echo. Not because the truth was unreachable, but because it had been declared unnecessary. And in that declaration lay the final, quiet violence of the story, not against the victims, but against the idea that truth, however complex, is worth pursuing even when it refuses to cooperate. The night of December 30th, 1999, stayed exactly where it had always been, frozen, intact, indifferent to the narratives built around it. The city changed. The system adapted. The file closed. But the questions, patient and unyielding, waited as they always had, for someone to stop asking whether the case was over, and start asking whether it had ever truly been understood. Understanding, when it finally began to resurface, didn't come from a single revelation, but from accumulation, from the slow stacking of details that had been dismissed too easily. It came from people who no longer felt bound by hierarchy or career, people for whom the risk of speaking had diminished with time. Their voices were quiet, fragmented, sometimes contradictory, but together they traced the outline of a story that felt closer to the texture of that night than the official version ever had. One former analyst spoke about a pattern that had bothered him for years, a pattern not in the evidence itself, but in how it was handled. Certain items were revisited repeatedly, tested and retested, while others were examined once and then set aside. The selection wasn't random. It followed a logic that became clearer only in retrospect. Evidence that aligned with emerging theories was refined, elevated, polished. Evidence that complicated those theories was labeled inconclusive and allowed to fade. This wasn't sabotage. It was efficiency. It was the quiet discipline of focus, narrowing the field until only one path remained visible. That narrowing shaped everything that followed. Once a suspect became the center of gravity, the case bent toward him. Timelines adjusted. Interpretations shifted. Ambiguities resolved themselves conveniently. The past, once fluid and uncertain, hardened into a sequence of events that felt inevitable, almost predetermined. It was a powerful illusion, one reinforced by repetition and authority, and by the human tendency to prefer coherence over contradiction. The killer's behavior that night, once a source of fascination and dread, was gradually stripped of its strangeness. Early descriptions emphasized how unusual it was, how rarely crimes unfolded with such calm persistence. Later descriptions framed it as a variant of known patterns, something that could be explained, categorized, neutralized. The mystery was domesticated, made safe for consumption. What couldn't be explained was no longer central to the story. Yet the strangeness remained, stubborn and unresolved. The choice of weapon, the sequence of violence, the decision to stay. Each element taken alone might fit within established frameworks. Together, they formed a constellation that resisted simplification. Some investigators had once speculated that the killer's actions suggested not just confidence, but expectation, as if he knew the night would stretch open before him, uninterrupted. That expectation, if true, raised questions no one wanted to answer. Who expects not to be discovered? Who enters a family's home and behaves as though time belongs to them? The final narrative offered psychological explanations, abstractions that floated above the specifics. They were neat, reassuring, and ultimately unsatisfying. They explained behavior without explaining context. They named traits without naming circumstances. As these doubts circulated quietly, a different kind of memory began to surface, not from officials, but from the periphery. A former neighbor recalled a man she had seen occasionally near the building months before the murders. Someone who didn't seem lost, someone who lingered without purpose. She had mentioned it once early on and been told it was likely nothing. Years later, she wasn't sure if the memory was real or shaped by time, but the feeling attached to it remained, a sense of unease she couldn't quite justify. Another resident remembered maintenance work that had been done in the building that year, routine, unremarkable, except for how easily access was granted, how little oversight there had been. Names were recorded, but records were incomplete. It was a minor administrative failure, common enough to be ignored, but it fed into a larger pattern of porous boundaries, of familiarity without intimacy, of access without accountability. None of this pointed cleanly to an alternative culprit. That was the most frustrating part. The doubts didn't coalesce into a counter-narrative strong enough to replace the official one. They hovered instead, eroding confidence without offering certainty in return. For institutions, this kind of ambiguity is intolerable. For individuals, it is harder to dismiss. The suspect, distant and silent, became a canvas onto which these frustrations were projected. Some saw him as a scapegoat, a convenient endpoint for a story that had gone on too long. Others saw him as guilty beyond doubt, the embodiment of a horror that needed a face. The lack of direct access to him allowed both interpretations to exist simultaneously, unchallenged by new information. His silence became part of the machinery, preserving the conclusion by preventing further complication. Over time, the case slipped into a strange afterlife. It was cited less often, discussed more carefully. When it appeared in training materials or retrospectives, it was framed as a triumph of persistence, a reminder that no crime is beyond reach. The subtext, the years of uncertainty and drift, were omitted. The story had been cleaned, its rough edges filed down until it fit comfortably within the system's self-image. But stories like this resist comfort. They resurface in unexpected ways, in conversations sparked by unrelated cases, in comparisons drawn too casually. When another long unsolved crime ended abruptly, with an arrest that felt rushed, people invoked Tokyo without naming it, a shared reference point that needed no explanation. The pattern was becoming recognizable, and that recognition brought unease. In private, some officials acknowledged the discomfort. They spoke of the difficulty of balancing transparency with stability, of the fear that reopening old cases could undermine public trust. It was a paradox they couldn't escape. Admitting uncertainty might erode confidence, but suppressing it risked something worse. The decision again and again favored control. For the families of victims in other cases, the Tokyo story became a warning whispered rather than shouted. Closure, they learned, is not always synonymous with truth. An arrest can end an investigation, but it cannot end doubt. That lesson, hard-earned and quietly shared, was perhaps the most enduring legacy of the case. The night itself remained unchanged, impervious to reinterpretation. For lives ended, a home was violated, a city was shaken. No amount of narrative adjustment could alter those facts. What changed was everything built around them. The scaffolding of meaning erected in the aftermath, adjusted over years to support an ending that felt necessary, even if it wasn't complete. As the decades stretched on, the voices questioning that ending grew fewer, not because they were convinced, but because fatigue took its toll. Carrying doubt is heavy. It demands energy, attention, resilience. Most people eventually set it down, choosing peace over precision. The system relied on that exhaustion, knowingly or not. And yet, the case never fully disappeared. It lingered like a scar that fades but never vanishes, a mark that reminds without explaining. For those who looked closely, it offered a quiet lesson about power and narrative, about how truth can be shaped not only by lies, but by omission, by emphasis, by the simple act of deciding when to stop asking questions. The Tokyo 1999 cold case had been closed, sealed with authority and time. But beneath that seal, the pressure remained, building slowly, imperceptibly, as unanswered questions do. Not enough to rupture the surface, not enough to force a reckoning, but enough to ensure that the story would never rest easy, never settle into the clean finality it had been promised. Because some mysteries don't demand to be solved, they demand to be acknowledged. And in the long shadow of that December night, acknowledgement, not certainty, remained the one thing still out of reach. Acknowledgement, when it threatens to surface, often does so through comparison, through the uncomfortable mirror of repetition. Years after the Tokyo case was closed, another long-dormant investigation in a different prefecture ended with a sudden arrest, another press conference heavy with confidence and light on detail. For those who remembered Tokyo, the rhythm felt familiar. The language echoed. The assurances sounded rehearsed. And once again, questions were framed as obstacles rather than obligations. This pattern didn't go unnoticed. Analysts began speaking more openly, not about specific cases but about tendencies. They discussed how unresolved crimes age within institutions, how they become symbols that distort priorities, how the desire to resolve them can override the humility that genuine inquiry requires. Tokyo 1999 became an unspoken benchmark, a reference point that hovered in the background of these conversations like a cautionary outline. What made Tokyo different, what made it linger, was the sheer intimacy of the crime. This wasn't violence at a distance. It was violence embedded in domestic space, in the rhythms of family life. The killer didn't just end lives. He occupied them, if only briefly, moving through rooms that held routines, memories, ordinary trust. That intimacy demanded an explanation that went beyond pathology. It demanded context. Early on, investigators had tried to provide that context. They mapped the family's routines, their relationships, their movements through the city. They looked for friction points, for points of contact with the outside world. Most of what they found was unremarkable. The Miyazawas were ordinary by every measure, which made the crime more unsettling, not less. Randomness was an easy explanation, but it felt inadequate even then. As years passed, the absence of motive became normalized. The crime was recast as an anomaly, a statistical outlier. This reframing allowed the system to move forward without resolving the most troubling question of all: why this family in this place on that night? The arrest didn't answer that question. It simply removed it from the list. In quiet moments, some investigators admitted that motive had been the hardest part, not to find but to face. A clear motive would have implied connection, proximity, perhaps failure to see what was happening in plain sight. An unclear motive preserved distance. It allowed the crime to remain abstract, safely contained within the boundaries of individual deviance. The suspect's profile supported this abstraction. His life, as presented, was a series of disconnected fragments, a narrative of drift that resisted deeper interpretation. He was portrayed as a figure without anchors, without roots, someone who moved through society without leaving impressions. That portrayal made it easier to accept that his actions, however extreme, emerged from nowhere and returned to nowhere. The environment, the community, the system remained untouched. But the environment had always been part of the story. The building's design, the lack of surveillance, the routines that went unobserved because they were trusted. These factors weren't causes, but they were conditions. Ignoring them didn't make the crime simpler. It made the explanation thinner. The more the official narrative narrowed, the more the peripheral details took on weight. The way the killer used household items, the way he cleaned some things and ignored others, the way he seemed to understand which risks mattered and which didn't. These behaviors suggested learning, adaptation, an awareness shaped by experience rather than impulse. They hinted at a relationship with the space that the final story never fully addressed. For the public, these nuances were largely invisible. The case had been resolved, and resolution carries authority. It demands acceptance. To question it feels transgressive, disrespectful. People internalized that boundary. They learned not to linger on doubts, not to voice them too loudly. Over time, silence did what arguments could not. It normalized the ending. Yet normalization didn't equal belief. Surveys conducted years later, unrelated to the case but touching on trust in institutions, revealed a subtle shift. People expressed confidence in outcomes, but less confidence in processes. They believed crimes would be solved eventually, but they were less certain that every solution reflected the full truth. This erosion was gradual, almost invisible, but it mattered. The Tokyo case had played a role in that shift, not because it was unique, but because it was emblematic. It showed how a system could appear strong while avoiding vulnerability, how closure could be presented as justice without fully engaging with uncertainty. For many, this realization didn't lead to outrage. It led to resignation. Resignation in its own way is powerful. It dampens scrutiny. It lowers expectations. It allows institutions to operate without the friction of constant challenge. But it also leaves something behind, a quiet cynicism that settles into the background of civic life. People stop asking whether an answer is complete. They ask only whether it is sufficient. In the years following the arrest, commemorations of the Miyazawa family became increasingly subdued. The focus shifted from the crime to themes of resilience and remembrance. These were important, necessary rituals. But they also served to redirect attention away from unresolved questions, toward emotions that could be shared without controversy. The apartment, once a focal point of attention, faded from public consciousness. New residents came and went. The story became something you had to seek out, something preserved in archives and long-form documentaries rather than daily conversation. This fading was natural, perhaps inevitable. Time moves on. Memory adapts. But for those who continued to revisit the case, who reread transcripts and compared timelines, the discomfort never fully disappeared. They noticed how often the official narrative relied on the absence of alternatives, rather than the strength of its own explanation. They noticed how rarely dissenting perspectives were engaged on their own terms. They noticed how the language of certainty replaced the language of inquiry. The case, in this way, became less about a single crime and more about a pattern of response. It offered insight into how societies manage unresolved trauma, how they choose endings when clarity remains elusive. It raised uncomfortable questions about the relationship between truth and stability, about whether the two can always coexist. As decades passed, the night of December 30, 1999, receded further into history, but its shadow remained long. Not as fear, not as panic, but as a quiet recalibration of trust. People learned, perhaps unconsciously, that some answers arrive not because they are complete, but because they are necessary. And in that understanding lay the final irony of the Tokyo 1999 cold case. It had been closed to preserve confidence, to demonstrate endurance and resolve. But in doing so, it had revealed something more fragile, something harder to repair. The thin line between certainty and honesty, and the cost of choosing one over the other when the truth refuses to be simple. That cost didn't announce itself with scandal or collapse. It seeped in quietly, altering expectations rather than breaking them. People stopped believing that every question would be answered, and institutions learned to operate within that lowered horizon. The Tokyo case wasn't cited, wasn't blamed, but it hovered there as an unspoken reference, a reminder of how endings can be manufactured without ever fully resolving beginnings. In the years that followed, small anomalies continued to surface, usually dismissed before they could gather momentum. A misdated memo referenced in an unrelated appeal. A footnote in a forensic journal that contradicted a key assumption in the case summary. A retired prosecutor's casual remark at a symposium about narratives that hardened too early. Each instance passed without consequence. Individually, they meant little. Collectively, they suggested a story that had never stopped moving, even after it was declared still. What made these anomalies unsettling was not that they pointed clearly to error, but that they resisted absorption. They didn't fit the established framework, and so they floated at the edges, unresolved. For people attuned to such details, this was familiar territory. It was how doubt survived, not by confronting authority head-on, but by lingering where authority rarely looked. The Miyazawa family's name, invoked less frequently now, carried a different weight. It was no longer just a symbol of tragedy. It had become shorthand for something more abstract, the moment when certainty overtook curiosity. This transformation wasn't intentional. It emerged naturally as stories do, shaped by retelling and omission. Over time, the family's lives were remembered in broad strokes. Their individuality softened, their routines generalized. What remained vivid was the crime and then the resolution. The long middle, the years of not knowing, faded. For the families of other victims watching from a distance, this arc was instructive. It taught them that patience has limits, not just emotionally but institutionally. That there comes a point where the system's need for closure becomes louder than the victim's need for truth. Some found comfort in this. Others found fear. Both reactions were understandable. Inside investigative units, unofficial conversations acknowledged the lesson more openly. Younger officers were warned gently about cases that drag on too long, about how they can distort priorities, how they can become reputational risks. The advice wasn't to cut corners, not explicitly. It was to manage expectations, to recognize when a story needs an ending. The implication was subtle but clear. Resolution is a value in itself. This mindset didn't emerge from cynicism. It emerged from pressure, from budgets and public scrutiny and political oversight. It emerged from the human desire to believe that effort leads to answers. The Tokyo case, with its sudden arrest after decades of stagnation, reinforced that belief. It showed that persistence could be rewarded, even if the path to that reward remained opaque. But opacity has consequences. It creates space for speculation, for alternative narratives that flourish precisely because official ones leave gaps. In the Tokyo case, those gaps were never dramatic enough to provoke backlash. They were too technical, too procedural, too subtle. But they accumulated, forming a quiet undercurrent of mistrust that never quite dissipated. Documentary filmmakers revisiting the case years later found this undercurrent difficult to capture. On the surface, the story was complete. There was a crime, an investigation, an arrest. Anything beyond that felt like interpretation rather than fact. Funding favored stories with clear arcs, not unresolved tensions. The Tokyo case resisted simplification, and so it was often left alone, mentioned but not explored. Those who did explore it faced a familiar dilemma. How do you question an ending without appearing to disrespect the dead? How do you probe uncertainty without implying failure? These questions shape the tone of every inquiry, every article, every discussion. Most chose caution. A few chose silence. Silence over time became part of the architecture of the case. It wasn't enforced. It was learned. People sensed where the boundaries were and adjusted accordingly. This self-regulation was perhaps the most effective form of control, because it required no directives, no censorship. It relied on shared understanding. Yet even within that silence, the night itself remained vivid to those who had lived through it. They remembered the sudden heaviness that settled over the city, the way conversations changed, the way doors felt thinner. They remembered how the case had lingered, unresolved, shaping years of collective anxiety. For them, the abruptness of the ending never fully reconciled with the length of the waiting. As time passed, anniversaries came and went with diminishing attention. The case slipped further into the past, its emotional charge diffused by distance. But distance also brought perspective. People began to see the case not as an isolated event, but as part of a broader pattern, a reflection of how societies deal with uncertainty over long periods. The Tokyo case became a reference not for what happened, but for how it was handled. In academic circles, this perspective took on a life of its own. Courses on criminal justice reform used anonymized versions of the case to illustrate the dangers of outcome-driven investigation. Students debated ethics and incentives, often unaware that the scenario they were discussing mirrored a real, unresolved discomfort. The lessons were theoretical. The implications were not. The suspect remained absent from these discussions, a ghost at the center of the story. His lack of presence made it easier to talk about systems and processes without confronting individual responsibility. This abstraction suited everyone. It allowed critique without accusation, analysis without consequence. And yet the absence was telling. In cases where guilt is clear and accepted, the individual looms large. Their actions, their words, their psychology dominate the narrative. Here the individual receded, replaced by structures and narratives and decisions made over time. It was as if the system itself had become the protagonist. That realization unsettled some. It suggested that the most important forces in the story were not confined to one night in 1999, but stretched across decades, shaping and reshaping the meaning of that night. It suggested that the true mystery wasn't who committed the crime, but how the story of the crime evolved, and why it settled where it did. As the city continued to change, as skylines shifted and neighborhoods transformed, the memory of the Miyazawa case adapted too. It became quieter, more abstract, less immediate. But it didn't disappear. It remained embedded in the collective consciousness as a faint tension, a reminder that closure can be achieved without resolution, that certainty can coexist with doubt. And in that coexistence lay the enduring discomfort of the Tokyo 1999 cold case. It was closed, yes, But it was closed in a way that left something unfinished, something that resisted being named. Not a conspiracy, not a scandal, but a lingering sense that the story as told was not the only one possible. That sense followed the case into history, where it waited, patient and unresolved, for a future willing to ask not whether the ending was acceptable, but whether it was honest. Honesty, when deferred for too long, takes on a different shape. It stops looking like revelation and starts looking like disruption. By the time the Tokyo case reached this stage of quiet historical distance, any attempt to reopen it felt less like investigation and more like an act of defiance against time itself. The system had moved on. The city had moved on. Even many of those who once questioned the ending had learned to live with the discomfort, folding it into a broader acceptance that not all truths arrive cleanly. And yet, fragments kept surfacing, not because someone was searching aggressively, but because the past has a way of resurfacing when it's been compressed too tightly. A private collection of tapes, recorded interviews from the early 2000s, surfaced when a former journalist passed away. They weren't sensational. They didn't contain confessions or revelations. What they contained was tone, hesitation, doubt, voices of investigators speaking candidly before the pressure to conclude had hardened their language. Listening to them decades later, the contrast was striking. The uncertainty was palpable, the humility unmistakable. It was a version of the case that no longer existed anywhere else. Those tapes circulated quietly among a small group of researchers and reporters. No one rushed to publish them. The decision wasn't driven by fear of reprisal, but by uncertainty about purpose. What would publishing them achieve? The case was closed. The suspect was convicted. The family had endured enough. Reopening the wound seemed cruel, even if the wound had never truly healed. This hesitation revealed something important. The desire for truth was still there, but it was now competing with empathy, with caution, with the recognition that truth, when delayed, can harm as much as it helps. The Tokyo case had reached a point where honesty was no longer a clear good. It was a risk, a destabilizing force. That realization troubled those who encountered it. It suggested that time doesn't just obscure facts. It changes the moral landscape around them. What once felt urgent becomes optional. What once demanded answers becomes a matter of interpretation. The longer a case remains unresolved, the more invested people become in whatever resolution finally arrives, even if it's incomplete. The official record of the Tokyo case reflected this shift. Early documents were exploratory, filled with questions and branching possibilities. Later documents were declarative, streamlined, confident. The transition wasn't marked by a breakthrough moment. It was gradual, almost invisible, the result of countless small decisions about wording, emphasis, and relevance. By the time the arrest occurred, the record itself had been shaped to accommodate it. This wasn't fabrication. It was curation. And curation, when applied over decades, can be just as powerful. For those who studied institutional behavior, the case became a quiet exemplar. Not of corruption but of convergence, the way multiple pressures can align to produce a single stable narrative. Public expectation, internal fatigue, political oversight, media cycles. Each force nudged the story in the same direction, toward closure, toward simplicity, toward an ending that could be defended. The suspect's conviction served that purpose. It provided a focal point, a name, a conclusion. It allowed the case to be filed away, its lessons distilled into manageable themes: perseverance, patience, justice delayed but delivered. These were the phrases repeated in retrospectives, the ones that fit comfortably within institutional self-understanding. What was left out were the costs, the narrowing of inquiry, the sidelining of ambiguity, the quiet discomfort of those who sensed that something essential had been lost in the process. These elements didn't translate well into summaries or speeches. They were experiential, emotional, resistant to simplification. As a result, they persisted only in private, in conversations that ended with shrugs rather than conclusions. People would say, "Something about that case never sat right," and then move on, lacking the language or energy to unpack the feeling further. Over time, even that gesture became rare. The apartment itself, now fully absorbed into the fabric of the neighborhood, bore no visible trace of its history. Children played nearby. New routines formed. Life asserted its dominance over memory, but for those who knew, the space carried a different resonance. Not haunted, not cursed, but marked like a sentence that ends with a period when a question mark might have been more honest. In the broader context of criminal justice, the Tokyo case faded into the background, overshadowed by newer controversies, more overt failures. It wasn't cited in reform debates or policy discussions. It didn't provoke outrage. Its influence was subtler, shaping expectations rather than arguments. It taught people quietly that some truths are negotiable, that some endings are chosen. This lesson wasn't taught explicitly. It was absorbed through repetition, through the normalization of unresolved discomfort. Over time, it became part of the cultural understanding of how institutions operate, an unspoken rule that not every story will be told in full. For the Miyazawa family, whose loss had been the center of everything, the passage of time brought its own complexities. Public attention faded. Private grief evolved. The arrest, whatever its shortcomings, had marked an end to the waiting, and that mattered. Whether it marked an end to the truth was a question few were willing to ask on their behalf. And so the case settled into its final form, not as a solved mystery, but as a completed narrative. Its power lay not in the clarity of its answers, but in the ambiguity it left behind. It stood as a reminder that the stories societies tell about justice often reveal more about their needs than about their facts. The Tokyo 1999 cold case was no longer active, no longer debated, no longer urgent. But it remained instructive, a quiet testament to the complexities of closure, the compromises of endurance, and the subtle ways in which truth can be reshaped by time. What lingered most was not anger or suspicion, but a subdued awareness, the understanding that certainty once declared is rarely revisited, even when it rests on foundations that were never fully examined. And in that understanding, the case found its final uneasy place, not as an open wound, but as a scar, visible only if you know where to look. The scar, once noticed, never quite fades. It doesn't throb. It doesn't demand attention. It simply exists, a quiet reminder embedded in the body of the city, in the memory of a case that promised certainty and delivered something thinner. By the time Tokyo had fully absorbed the ending, by the time the words case closed, lost their edge and became administrative fact, the most important shift had already occurred. People had stopped expecting the truth to feel complete. This wasn't cynicism. It was adaptation, a recalibration of belief, the understanding that justice as practiced is often an approximation, a shape fitted to the limits of patience, resources, and narrative endurance. The Tokyo 1999 cold case became one of the places where that understanding settled, quietly, without protest. For those who still carried the case with them, not as a file or a headline but as a lived presence, the ending never produced the silence they had imagined. It produced a different sound, softer, more ambiguous. Not relief, not anger. Something closer to acceptance without conviction. The kind that allows life to continue, but never fully forgets. They remembered the early days most clearly. The uncertainty, the honesty of not knowing. The way investigators spoke then, careful, tentative, acknowledging the limits of what could be said. That version of the case, fragile and unresolved, felt closer to the reality of what had happened than the polished certainty that arrived decades later. Felt truer not because it had answers but because it admitted it didn't. The arrest had changed the language. It had changed what could be said out loud. Questions that once felt natural began to feel inappropriate. Curiosity was reframed as suspicion, doubt as disloyalty. The story hardened, and with it, the boundaries of acceptable thought. No one announced this shift. No memo circulated. It happened the way such things always do, through repetition and reinforcement, through the quiet social cues that tell people when to stop asking. Over time, the questions retreated inward, living on only in private thought, in the brief pauses that followed certain statements, in the feeling that something essential had been bypassed. The killer, whoever he truly was, receded into abstraction. The convicted man existed legally, definitively. But the figure who moved through that apartment in 1999, who knew where to step, where to sit, how long to stay, remained elusive. He was never fully captured by the narrative that claimed to contain him. He lived instead in the gaps, in the behaviors that didn't align, in the confidence that was never adequately explained. And maybe that was the final truth the case revealed. That not all crimes yield to resolution in the way we expect. That some acts fracture reality in ways that cannot be neatly repaired by conclusions, however authoritative. That the demand for an ending can sometimes outweigh the capacity for understanding. The community learned to live with this, just as it had learned to live with the crime itself. The apartment became just another place. The date became just another line in a history book. The case became just another example cited when discussing cold cases that refused to stay buried. Life moved forward because it always does. But forward doesn't always mean away. Every so often, something small would bring it back. A headline about another decades-old crime suddenly solved. Adagiemente riclipri familiar frases. A conversation that drifted unexpectedly toward trust and doubt and the meaning of justice. In those moments, the Tokyo case resurfaced, not loudly, but insistently, reminding those who remembered that endings are not the same as truths. The title still sounded definitive. Tokyo 1999 Cold Case Closed. Arrest reveals decades-long cover-up. It read like a conclusion, like a door shutting. But behind that door, the air never quite settled. Too many decisions had been made too late. Too many questions had been retired rather than answered. Too much weight had been placed on the comfort of closure. In the end, the case did close. Files were sealed. Procedures completed. The system moved on, satisfied that it had done what was required. What it left behind was not outrage, not scandal, but something quieter and more enduring. A lesson about the limits of certainty. Because the most unsettling thing about the Tokyo 1999 cold case is not the possibility that the wrong person was held accountable. It's the possibility that the right questions were never allowed to matter once any answer was finally chosen. And so the story ends the way it has always existed, suspended between what is known and what is accepted, between the record and the memory, between a city that learned to live with an ending and a truth that never fully arrived. The apartment is quiet now. The files are closed. The headlines have faded. But somewhere beneath the certainty, the silence remains. The silence doesn't mark an ending so much as a continuation in another register, one that doesn't announce itself with words or documents, but with absence. After everything has been said, after every statement has been filed and every conclusion affirmed, what remains is the space where questions used to live. That space doesn't stay empty. It hums faintly with unresolved meaning. In Tokyo, that hum blended into the city's background noise. It became part of the urban rhythm, indistinguishable unless you knew how to listen for it. Most people didn't. They went about their lives, trusting that systems functioned as intended, that endings meant something definitive. But for those who had followed the case closely, who had carried it through years of uncertainty, the silence felt curated, shaped with as much intention as any announcement. Time softened the edges, but it didn't erase the contours. New technology emerged, promising unprecedented clarity in forensic work. Algorithms improved, databases expanded, cold cases around the world were reopened and reevaluated, some with astonishing results. Each breakthrough reignited a familiar question. If this can be done now, what about then? What about Tokyo? The answer was always the same. The case was resolved. Further examination was unnecessary. That word, unnecessary, carried weight. It suggested sufficiency, completeness. It implied that curiosity had exceeded its mandate. And yet, curiosity has a way of persisting, especially when it's been denied rather than satisfied. It reemerged in unexpected places, in classrooms where students questioned hypotheticals that felt too close to reality, in late-night discussions among journalists who had learned to read between official lines, in private correspondence that never made it into print. One such exchange, uncovered years later, captured the mood precisely. Two former investigators, long retired, wrote to each other about the case in guarded terms. They didn't accuse. They didn't speculate wildly. They simply acknowledged a shared discomfort, a sense that the ending hadn't aligned with the beginning. Maybe this is as good as it gets, one wrote. The other replied, maybe, but I wish we'd been allowed to find out. Allowed. The word lingered. Because at the heart of the Tokyo case wasn't just a crime or an investigation, but a question of permission. Who is permitted to keep asking? Who decides when inquiry becomes inconvenience? Who benefits when uncertainty is retired early? These questions didn't threaten the official record. They existed alongside it, parallel and largely invisible. They didn't demand action. They demanded reflection. And reflection, unlike accusation, is difficult to suppress without revealing insecurity. As years passed, the case began to be remembered less